Yes.
Because I want. It's okay. Thank you. You can start.
Okay. Can we get the PowerPoint on the screen?
Yes. Can you see it?
No. I just see there. Yes. Perfect. Oh, now it went away.
I think it has delay.
Okay. No, it's there now. May I begin? Oops. No.
Yes, please.
Okay. First, everyone, I'm so sorry. It is all my fault. And as you well know, all of you, people of my generation are not the best technicians when it comes to computers, although I thought I knew, but I didn't. Anyway, so today, as you see, I'm going to be talking about how foreign and found art changed Safavid painting. As I mentioned earlier, I stole the title from an author named Robert Hughes, who wrote a book on the subject of how modern art was formed by the confrontation with new ideologies, technologies, and new visual material with which the artists were not previously familiar. This began in the late 19th century, I think is most obvious in the work of Picasso, particularly the famous painting of Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which he painted after seeing African masks and other African art on view in Paris. And that changed his outlook, that contributed to the growth of Cubism, etc. But we're not talking about that today. What I'm interested in talking about is how Safavid artists were influenced in the 16th and 17th centuries by encounters with art and people from periods and places other than their own. So by 1501, Shah Ismail came to the throne. That's when he came to the throne. And Persian painting had already developed into a very highly refined art. Best known, of course, from manuscript illustrations and from some album muraqa paintings and drawings. Figural wall paintings, so wall paintings with figures, were, of course, in existence, particularly in palaces, but over time, they were mostly lost or overpainted, or buildings were torn down. And only a few archaeological and poetic references bear witness to that art form. Thus, if we jump back to the early 16th century, we find a new Safavid court at Tabriz, with a court library in which calligraphers and bookbinders, painters, and librarians all worked. As the Safavid control over Iran expanded, so apparently did the royal library. Thus, precious volumes that had been in the Timurid library in Herat and other Timurid libraries entered the Safavid Royal Library in Tabriz. So first slide, please, or second slide. Hello, can we have the next slide, please? I don't know. We need the, that's not the next slide. Is it? Okay, well, just a minute. So not very much is known about Shah Ismail as a patron. Could we go, yes, that's the first slide. A patron of the arts, but he is most likely responsible for commissioning an illustrated Shahnameh around 1515, perhaps to commemorate the birth of his oldest son, Tahmasp. Unfortunately, the manuscript was unfinished, and but the project did engage artists who had already worked for the previous Al-Qoyunlu regime in Tabriz. So one of these was Sultan Muhammad, and he was described by the author Qazi Ahmad as a native of Tabriz who was Shah Tahmasp's painting teacher. And he was excellent at portraying the Qizilbash. Now, the Qizilbash were the Turkmen soldiers mostly who supported the Safavids and helped them come to power. Some of them were a bit wild and, well, whatever, and not sort of urbane. And so to portray them meant being able to capture that sort of spirit of the Qizilbash. So Sultan Muhammad is presumed to have been the first director of the ambitious illustrated Shahnameh, thought to have been commissioned around 1524, the year that Shah Tahmasp came to power. The painting on the screen, and I hope you can see it, it's quite small on my screen, but it needs to be seen large. This portrays Tahmasp defeating the Deves. So it's attributed to Sultan Muhammad. So as you see Tahmasp on his horse, and he's bashing a black Dev on the head with his mace, but a group of other Devs is cowering in the lower left corner, in fear, of course, of what's going to happen to them. And one hides behind a rock right there, while pulling the tail of another Dev who is being led away by a chain by another horseman. Sultan Muhammad has also presented this array of hideous, though very amusing, Devs with horrible teeth, eyes with yellow eyelids, and even one of them has a nose like a trunk of an elephant, sort of short trunk of an elephant. Now, certainly they would have had terrible breath too, you can imagine. Although the story of Rustam killing the white Dev had been illustrated in the 15th century, these Devs seem to have sprung from another source. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, part of the process of conquering Iran involved looting the libraries of places like Herat and expropriating the Turkmen libraries in Tabriz. Along with the books, these included albums, muraqqas, that had calligraphies and pictures in them. Amongst the most extensive and interesting of these would have been albums containing paintings like this one on silk of demons or others of ruffians, as well as Chinese-inspired drawings and even works based on European prototypes. Because so little is written about early 16th century artists, I cannot confirm my theory that Sultan Muhammad's concept of what Dives looked like was revolutionized by his encounter with the paintings in these albums, which would not have been in the possession of the Aqayunlu before the Safavids, but entered the library following the Safavid occupation of Herat in 1510. Some years later, when the Shahnameh project, the big one, was conceived, Sultan Muhammad would have been challenged with forming a team, a big team of artists, and finding source material for the 258 illustrations in the manuscript. Luckily, right there in Tehran at the Museum of Contemporary Art, there are 118 of those paintings from that Shahnameh that you can go and see. Anyway, so the albums and books in the Safavid library would have been a rich supply of images, some of them new and unforeseen. So as menacing as these creatures on the screen appear, they are actually engaged in mundane tasks such as grinding seeds or spices. That the big black one in the middle and the one on the right, maybe his wife, but hard to tell. That's what they're doing. And turned on its side, there's one showing a bottle to his fellow Div. Could we have the next slide, please? Next slide. Thank you. So nonetheless, so I've turned it so you can see those two. Their hideous faces, their lack of clothes or just the simple skirts they wear, their ankle bracelets, and even the pose of the figure in the slide on the left, the figure on the right, the one who's holding the bottle, all have been adapted by Sultan Muhammad to the Divs in his painting. Even if Sultan Muhammad did not see this actual painting from the albums, the figure behind the rock in his painting, so this one, who holds that pink Div's tail, you can see he's grasping the tail. He has a similar pose and sort of grimace on his face with bared teeth to those of this Div holding the bottle. It's just in reverse. It is highly likely he adapted such a figure to his own composition in Tahmaras defeating the Divs. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Thank you. Perhaps the most famous of all illustrations to Shah Tahmasb's Shahnameh is The Court of Qumars by Sultan Muhammad. It is one of the few paintings referred to by any 16th century author. In 1544, so only 20 years or less after the painting was done, Dost Muhammad mentions, quote, a scene of people wearing leopard skins. It is such that the lion-hearted of the jungle of depiction bend their necks before the awesomeness of his pictures. So he's head and shoulders above the other artists in the beauty of this painting and of his work. Now, in the painting, Kumars is seated at the top, or enthroned at the top of the mountain, while his son Siamak is here to the right, and the angel Soroush stands to the left. So here's Soroush. He's forewarning them of the attack of the evil Ahriman. Man and beast are all arrayed around the slopes of the mountain. And in the rocks are hundreds of hidden tiny faces, mostly humans, but some are animals as well. And because it's so tiny on my screen, it's going to be difficult for me to point out specific ones. But if it's big on your screen, I hope you can see those faces in the rocks. And there's even a camel somewhere in the rocks as well. So this rising oval composition and remarkable blending of the pigments, the blues, the greens, the purples, all together, elicits a sense of a peaceable kingdom. Down at the bottom are figures with wild animals in their arms. And so the animals and the people are all getting along just fine. Most of the figures have idealized faces with very finely arched brows and small noses and eyes and rounded cheeks. Of course, Soroush is a prime example of that. And the artist does not use shading in their faces to define their cheekbones or other features. It's all done with line and color. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Thank you. So even the figures who are eccentric, like this fellow, with his very long neck and kind of prominent Adam's apple, have no wrinkles on their faces. By contrast, the many faces in the rocks, and I just brought your attention to the faces here and here and here, all throughout here. There's another one right there. And they have modeling, so that he's used shading to show their features, and their expressions, of course, vary from scowling to singing or talking with the mouth open. Here's the scowling man down here, mustache and looking very fierce, and up here is a figure whose mouth is open, as if he or she is singing or talking. Now, I have long thought that by embedding the faces in the rocks so that they're not depicting the actual people standing there at the court of Kumars, this gave Sultan Muhammad an opportunity to deviate from the norm of Persian painting and to experiment with different facial types. But where would he have gotten the idea of using shading to define form? Next slide, please. Now, my suspicion is that European prints were also in the Royal Library. Certainly there are accounts of Italians visiting the Al-Qayumlu court, and there were others coming through. And I think that these formed part of Sultan Muhammad's newly discovered source material. I'm not suggesting that this print by Dürer on the right-hand side was actually there, but what I wanted to draw your attention to is that this peasant couple who are dancing have very heavily modeled faces. And his profile, in a sense, fits in with the many profiles of figures in the rocks. And I think that they are in no way idealized. He's really, Dürer was capturing the appearance of these people. And this technique may well have inspired Sultan Muhammad to try to incorporate that in his work, but again, not with the actual people that he's portraying in the court of Kumars, but with the rocks that look like people. And this then would have allowed him not to deviate from the conventions of early Safavid painting. Next slide, please. The slides I've shown so far are what I mean by how found art illustrated, influenced Sultan Muhammad. And because he would have found these images in the library that were not there before. And I'm assuming there was a huge amount of material there. So it's not as if the minute Safavids came to power, he could go and see it all in a day. It would have taken time. With this image, we jump back in time, but I was also going to say that before we do that, that Sultan Muhammad did not outright copy the Central Asian painting of Dives or the European prints. Rather, he kind of incorporated those ideas from those works into his own and produced a new interpretation of Dives and hidden faces in rocks, which also, the hidden faces in rocks had been a feature of 15th century painting in Iran too, but he had a new interpretation. Although prints were certainly foreign, one senses the impact of seeing them for the first time is what led to Sultan Muhammad's experiments with shading in particular and naturalism in general. For other artists, starting in the 15th century, the actual foreign objects found their way into paintings as well. So, as I say, we've gone back in time. This on the right is a painting by Behzad of the beggar before the king from a Mantiqater of 1487. And in it, Behzad has included a group of Chinese ceramics in this alcove on the left above the throne on the second story. Now, the blue and white flask on the bottom there, the two light green globular jars on the second level, and then there's little cups or bowls on stems up at the top. All of those are the type of wares that were exported from China in the 15th century, and they entered princely and noble collections in Iran. They were highly prized, and I guess the collection that is now in the National Museum in Tehran, but that came from the Ardabil Shrine, has a fantastic selection of these beautiful Chinese porcelains and celadons that would have been being traded from China. The blue bottles that you see on the three levels, the bottles, the ewer, and then some other jar-like things. They could either be Chinese or Iranian. There's a type of ware that was produced in the Ilkhanid period called Lajvardina, because it had blue glaze and then luster gilding over it. And they could have been made in the 15th century because there are little signs on these bottles of gold paint. But I've included this pre-Safavid example to demonstrate the desirability of elite foreign goods at the Timurid court and Behzad's use of them as a device to reinforce the royal identity of the king who sits below them in this illustration. Now, can I have the next slide, please? Next slide, please.
Can you see it?
Oh, yeah, I can. Can you? So
yes, of course.
Now, if we move on to the generation after Sultan Muhammad, we encounter Sheikh Muhammad, who was described by Iskandar Munshi Beg, another chronicler writing in 1616 and then 1629. He was described as an excellent calligrapher, portraitist, and artist who, quote, followed European painting, Farngi, in Iran and popularized it. Well, this painting of bandits attacking the caravan of Ainier and Ria from the 1556 to 65 Haft al-Rang of Jami that was made for Sultan Ibrahim Mirza, the nephew of Shah Tahmasp. This has been attributed to Sheikh Muhammad, but has only one item that could even be considered really foreign, much less sort of in the European style. And that is the matchlock rifle this fellow has here, which is aimed at the archer. Now, guns and cannons were first ordered from the Venetians during the reign of Uzun Hasan, the Aqliunlu leader in the third quarter of the 15th century, but they never arrived. And he lost the Battle of Bashkent to the Ottomans as a result. Although Shah Ismail had some artillery, the Ottomans were far better armed. And that was proven, of course, at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, where the Ottoman cannons led to the rout of the Safavids. It also led to the looting of Tabriz and the removal of many of those albums that had the Dives and the other Chinese pictures, etc., from Tabriz to Istanbul, where they still are in the Topkapı Saray library and other places. Okay. By the mid-16th century, handguns and long guns were more plentiful in Iran and begin to appear in manuscript illustrations. Nonetheless, in a scene such as this, Sheikh Muhammad has included only one rifle, which stands out as an exception to the swords, bows, and arrows and spears of the combatants. The gun does not reflect European painting, as I mentioned, so much as the novelty of European technology and the much expanded Safavid court of musketeers. However, and they're Tufangji, I think is what they're called. However, in addition to soldiers bearing firearms for battles and sieges, they also were employed to protect caravans from bandits. So the presence of the musketeer in this painting reflects modern Safavid practice, as well as reinforcing the narrative of Ainier and Ria's caravan to Medina being attacked by brigands. I have the next slide, please. Here, the drawing of kneeling youth reading from around 1555 to 60 bears the signature of Sheikh Muhammad, which is down below the figure, but does not reveal any reliance on European painting. What it does show is remarkable fluidity of line, which is consistent with the high opinion in which his Nastaliq script was held. The folds of the sleeves and the sure line of the figure's knees as they bend and shoulders bear witness to the artist's skill as a draftsman. This is reinforced by the extremely fine fur up here of the figure's cap around which his turban is wrapped. For all its artistic appeal, this drawing does not include any shading on the youth's face or very little in the drapery or on one of his hands. Form is defined by line, not illusionistic European techniques. Although Sheikh Muhammad's career lasted until the early 1590s, no extant single work from the years between 1560 and 1590 deviates stylistically from the one on the screen. And his illustrations conform to the prevailing style developed at the court of Sultan Ibrahim Mirza, Shah Tahmasp's nephew, as I mentioned. And Ibrahim Mirza was governor of Mashhad and then moved to Sabzevar. Sabzevar was the hometown of Sheikh Muhammad, so just incidentally. And Sultan Ibrahim was the patron, of course, of the manuscript that we've just looked at. So if Sheikh Muhammad painted works in the European mode, they have not surfaced in modern times. Yet, even without the actual evidence, his willingness to experiment with a foreign style laid the foundation for the artists who followed him. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of those artists who was slightly younger than Sheikh Muhammad was Sadiqi Beg. He decided to become an artist at the age of 32 after being a soldier and doing other things. And then he studied calligraphy and in 1568 moved to the Safavid capital, which was now at Qazvin, where he studied with the painter Muzaffar Ali. In 1576-77, when Shah Tahmasp's successor, Shah Ismail II, commissioned an illustrated Shahnameh, Sadiqi Beg was one of the artists who worked on it. This painting shows Rustam and Raksh killing a dragon, and it has an attribution to Sadiqi Beg on the right, like there, margin. I mean, the left-hand margin, sorry. Anyway, the composition, of course, is quite legible, and with Rustam slicing through the head of the dragon's throat, through his throat. Whoops, we lost it for a minute. Yeah, thank you. And the Raksh biting the dragon on the back. The form of the dragon, with its very long serpentine body, its horns, it has horns right there, golden horns, and golden flames springing from its shoulders, derives from the dragons found on Chinese ceramics and textiles, as well as on the drawings contained in the albums in the Safavid Royal Library. This type of dragon had been a fixture of Persian art at least since the Mongol invasion in the 13th century. Thus, by the time Sadiki Beg painted the illustration, he may have considered it to be an Iranian, not a Chinese dragon. In the same way, in his drawing on the left, from about 1600, the dragon has many of the same attributes as the painted version. However, the thick black line of the dragon's back recalls the slightly earlier work of Shah Kulu, an artist who emigrated from Iran to the Ottoman court of Sultan Suleiman, where he introduced a new style of drawing called the Saz style. His hallmark was serrated leaves and sort of composite blossoms. The thick black line or outline, like the one on the dragon's back, was characteristic of Shah Kulu's work. Since he had left Iran by 1521, Shah Kulu and Sadiki Beg would never have known each other. But Sadiki might have seen one of Shah Kulu's drawings and adapted the undulating outline of the dragon's back, considering it to be Ottoman, not Persian. Next slide, please. Okay, so a more direct borrowing from a foreign source is Sadiki Beg's painting of the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel, on the right, appeared to the Virgin Mary on the left to tell her that she was pregnant with Jesus. At the left, Mary holds, she's kneeling and she's holding a book with her left hand and raising her right one in surprise at the message the angel has conveyed. Her long hair is uncovered and the folds of her green dress betray their European source. Gabriel extends his right hand, which holds a banner with imaginary letters attached to a stick. That kind of ribbon is also called a banderol. Anyway, this would originally have had scripture, biblical words written on it, but here the letters are just meaningless. The angel gestures towards Mary with two fingers of his left hand, and both figures tilt their heads toward each other. The inscription between the two figures reads in translation, quote, "These two figures are in the manner of the Frankish masters, drawn while in the service of one giving asylum to those seeking the right path, the wonder of the age, Khwaja Ghiyas Naqshband, written by the servant Sadiki the librarian." Khwaja Ghiyas ad-Din Naqshband was a famous silk weaver and designer, known for his hospitality and connected to the court of Shah Abbas I. At the time this painting was produced, Sadiki Beg had been in charge of the royal library, but which is why he refers to himself as Kitabdar, but he lost that job just around this time. So perhaps he is referring to his generous friend because his friend helped him in that time. Something else I want to say, and I'll say it, go on about this, is that when you look at the drapery here, you see how it almost looks hard. It's not like the very fine silken garments that Persians were wearing in this period. The folds of their clothes don't fold like that. And part of the reason, of course, is that this was not that fine silk and light, very light. It in the original, and I'll talk about that in a minute, it would have been more like satin or a stiffer kind of material in the European context. So could I have the next slide, please? Now here, of course, you would expect anyway that the painting by Sadiki was based on a European print. And on the left, we have a print by the master of the banderols, the master of those ribbons, because they appear in many of his images. It shows the Annunciation and the main scene. It also has the Nativity and the Visitation here. So 3 very popular scenes from Christian iconography. Now, this master of the banderol was a Dutch artist working in Germany around 1470 to 80. But of course, prints were reprinted and copied, and this is a copy of the original. So the fact that it's about 100 or more years younger or older than the copy by Sadiki doesn't matter, because these things were circulating. They were cheap to reprint, and people brought them with them when they came from Europe. So the composition in the European print is pretty straightforward. You can see, of course, how Sadiki Beg has copied it, but he has reversed the original composition. Perhaps he made a tracing or a pounce where you pierce the paper that you're copying into to get the outline, or you pierce the tracing to get an outline. So anyway, that's how he would have transferred in general the composition. But as you can see, it's not a precise copy. The halos, the angel's wings, their wings here, the angel, the words on the ribbon, and other things like furniture and the setting behind them, all of those things have been omitted, and that deletes the kind of overt Christian symbolism of the original. Perhaps most noteworthy, though, as I mentioned, is the treatment of the drapery. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough. And there were other versions of this print anyway, so he might have seen a different version of it. Sadiki has picked up the idea of highlighting certain areas like the knees of the drapery, and then shading in other areas to define the form. So even if this was just a singular experiment, it announces the presence of European prints in Isfahan around 1600. And it demonstrates how, for some artists, these images were an irresistible source of astonishment and inspiration, and how, of course, they were going to take the challenge and see what they could do, though none of them seems, well, Sadiki certainly did not continue in this style. He went back to doing what he normally did. Next slide, please. I have the next slide, please. So another highly influential artist who worked for Shah Abbas was Reza Abbasi. He was born around 1565, and he was the son of Ali Asghar, who was a court artist at the court of Shah Ismail II. And because Shah Muhammad Khadabandeh was basically blind, all those artists had to go find their own way when he came to power in 1578, I guess, 77, 8. But Ali Asghar rejoined the Royal Library when Shah Abbas came to power in 1587. So Reza grew up in the Safavid Kitabkhane. And by the age of 20, he was producing paintings and drawings, such as the two on the screen. The figure on the right is a youth in a blue coat, and it's consistent with other portraits of the third quarter of the 16th century, painted in the so-called Qazvin style, after the capital, of course. He's tall and slim, and he has a slight smile on his face, and his robe blows gently in the wind. Is this a portrait of a specific individual, or is it an idealized, handsome youth? The signature of the humble Al-Khareza and the partially visible seal impression, which is under the man's foot, give no information about the identity of the sitter. So without distinguishing physical attributes, he remains anonymous, although I suspect in his day, he could be identified by his clothing or hair or the way he wrapped his turban, details that appear sort of generic to us over 400 years later. The drawing on the left of a seated man with a cup has an inscription stating that it was a design, tar, of Sheikh Muhammad and drawing of Al-Khareza. And the date is there. It's the year 1000 or 1591. So not only is this the earliest dated work, I mean, work that contains a date, by Reza, but also it demonstrates his close ties with the older artist Sheikh Muhammad. Once again, there's no sign of Sheikh Muhammad's or Reza's adoption of European painting. The figure has a lively expression and appears to be interacting with someone outside the picture frame. While Sheikh Muhammad might have outlined the figure and the cushion under his arm, the lines defining the cushion vary in thickness, like those of Sadiqi Beg, and then it becomes a hallmark of Reza's style too. And it characterizes his drawings for over half his career. This is one trait that drew high praise from Ghazi Ahmad and Eskandar Monchi Beg. Could I have the next slide, please? Next slide. For the first 10 or 15 years of Reza's career, he painted and drew single-page images of mostly men and some women for inclusion in albums. And he contributed illustrations to an unfinished Shahnameh, assumed to have been made for Shah Abbas when he came to the throne. Included in the figures he portrayed were fashionable young men and women, middle-aged and elderly men, dervishes, and peasants. However, in the early 1590s, an anomaly appears in his work. The drawing of a sleeping woman from about 1590 to 92 struck me as so atypical of his work in that period that I thought there must be something more than just observation of an actual half-dressed woman falling asleep while resting against two large cushions. There must be something more that led to this drawing. Except for the illustrations of Khosrow spying Shireen bathing, images of nude and semi-nude figures were highly unusual in Safavid painting, in the 16th century. Why would Reza have produced such a work? For over 10 years, I pondered this problem until one day at the British Museum, I was looking through a huge catalog of European prints for images that had inspired Mogul artists in India. I came across, and can you give me the next slide, please? This. And suddenly the bell went off in my head. This is a print by Marc Antonio Raimondi, which is based on a painting of Cleopatra by Raphael. The print dates to about 1515 to 27. I was immediately struck by the way Cleopatra has raised her arms and the cushion beneath her arm and torso. Now I began to understand what would have motivated Reza to draw a semi-nude woman. It was the shock of the new. And I'm sorry to make a terrible pun, or the shock of the nude is the other possibility, and the desire to incorporate the idea into his own work. I have the next slide, please. By placing the sleeping woman in the outdoors with a bottle of wine and a cup at the lower left, Reza has removed her from the iconographic context of Cleopatra, who has snakes wrapped around her arms and is on a bed or a couch and in an interior. Also, the eyes of the woman in the drawing of Reza originally were open, but later were drawn as closed. Despite the differences, the fact that Cleopatra is sleeping, her pose and her undressed state are the primary features that Reza borrowed and adapted in his drawing. Not long after he painted another semi-nude figure who was sleeping in a somewhat different pose and differently dressed, but clearly one led to the other. Although that was the end of his experimentation with this type of figure, a number of similar paintings in albums now in Istanbul reveal the impact of Reza's groundbreaking drawing on Safavid painting. So other artists borrowed this idea for both women and men. Okay, next slide, please. A few years after the Safavid capital moved to Isfahan in 1598, Reza rebelled for a while and left court service. But by about 1610, he had returned and resumed portraying the affluent youth of the capital. Additionally, reflecting the growing presence of Europeans in Isfahan, he painted a portrait of a European feeding wine to a dog. This is his last dated painting. So we had the first dated painting in the drawing of the man after Sheikh Muhammad, and now this is his latest painting. It's from 1634, which was 1 year before he died. And it includes a poem about pursuing a foreigner, فرنگی, in an empire of gulams, slaves. Possibly the figure depicted on the cushion, you see down here, who's looking up at the European, that may be a reference to a person who pursued a foreigner, but we don't know. It suggests that Reza was told about such behavior, but perhaps he may have observed it himself. The painting on the left is a portrait of Reza by his student, Mu'in Musavir, and It was begun in 1635, 1 month before Reza's death, and left unfinished for 40 years until 1673, and when he did complete it. Now, as you can see, Reza, I hope you can see, he's got a board propped on his knee, and he is working on a painting, and the painting is of a European wearing a hat just like this man's hat. My supposition is that Muin Musavir would not have portrayed his teacher in this way if Reza were not known for painting Europeans. Rather than adapt European techniques, Reza painted the Europeans themselves in his preferred style. Thus, his relationship to foreign art and foreigners was focused more on the subject matter, either what was depicted in prints or the Europeans themselves, than it was on the techniques that the Europeans used. Next slide, please. In the third quarter of the 17th century, the work of several artists exhibit Mogul influence. The slide on the right is attributable to Sheikh Abbasi, who was active between 1650 and 1683. It depicts Mary and Jesus, whose names are written on the painting to the left of the figures. Mary wears a crown, and out of that springs a peculiar green flame, perhaps a reference to the flaming aureole or a halo, but it's quite unusual. She wears a fancy ruby, pearl, and diamond necklace, jeweled belt and cuffs, and she holds a cloth in her hand, her left hand, that resembles a patka, the Indian sashes that have embroidered decoration at either end. Mary's face is darkly shaded on her right cheek, implying a light source coming from the right of the painting. So her right cheek, i.e. left on the painting, is shaded, but this cheek here is all lit up. The background has rounded hills that contain two clusters of buildings, as one would see in European and Mughal painting. In the sky are rows of birds. I hope you can see them. They're just faint up there, flying. And that also is a borrowing from Mughal painting. Because little is known of Sheikh Abbasi's life, his reasons for adapting Mughal motifs to his art are unclear. In some cases, the Mughals borrowed European motifs, such as the buildings in the background, and they are filtered into Sheikh Abbasi's work. Now, India was a major trading partner of Iran. Indian communities were established in the Persian Gulf and in some Iranian cities. So Sheikh Abbasi might have been familiar with Indians themselves. Alternatively, he could have traveled to India or simply studied Mughal painting. Whatever the mechanism, his work consistently includes either Mughal techniques or motifs or both, and must have appealed to Iranian patrons who included his works in their albums. The slide on the left of a prince on horseback with 3 attendants presents another approach to foreign people and their art. The painting is inscribed Ya Sahib Zaman, a phrase that's usually associated with the artist Muhammad Zaman. However, an analysis of the painting by Masume Farhad has led to the conclusion that the inscription is false and the work is by another painter of the second half of the 17th century, Ali Qoli Jabadar. Both he and Muhammad Zaman were proponents of incorporating European pictorial techniques in their work and were leading court artists. This painting seemingly focuses on the diversity of people employed by the main figure. And this prince, who's in his brocaded gold robe, riding a richly caparisoned horse, well-dressed horse. Behind him is a more plainly dressed man on horseback, whose turban has a flat red cap or kula. This may indicate that he is from the Caucasus or even from Turkey, Anatolia. The Caucasus was the source of many ghulams who served in the Safavid court, but those who entered the court as children were fully assimilated. So this man may have come to Iran as a free adult or as a mercenary. To the right are two figures on foot. The youth who is about to pour wine into a cup for the prince wears breeches, so short trousers, and a robe with an open skirt. His hat is identical to that of a royal bodyguard in an album of different Persian types compiled for European Engelbert Kempfer in 1685. On the far right is an Indian holding a platter of fruit. Now he's identified by his sash and his striped leggings and low turban. Although the meaning of this painting remains obscure, it combines European techniques such as modeling, the modeling of the cupbearer's blue breeches, for example. You see how it's lighter on his knees, and there are folds there. And it combines that with the presence of the Indian, who is apparently a servant of the prince. Since Ali Quli Jabadar's work ranges from paintings of European subjects, mythological subjects and others, to works in the Mogul style, such a grouping advertises his versatility and openness to foreign ideas and foreigners themselves. Next slide, please. The painting of two scholars conferring as a comet streaks overhead, and you see it just at the top of the painting, the comet, is signed by the humble Muhammad Zaman. It is painted in the Mogul style and includes bystanders in Indian turbans at the left. The faces are differentiated by their features and their skin color. Small figures appear in the middle ground, very hard to see, but they're there. And then there's a village or encampment in the further distance. Although a prototype for this painting and another of the same subject by Ali Quli Jabadar has not been identified, the work is clearly based on a Mogul image. Thanks to historical accounts of the comets that passed over Iran and India in the 17th century, the painting can be dated to 1664-65. This is fairly early in the career of Muhammad Zaman, and before his work became more reliant on European painting than Indian. However, at this point, the exposure to Mogul painting made a strong impression on him and his work. Eventually, he incorporated ideas of spatial recession and motifs such as the leafy tree at the right in many of his paintings. Next slide, please. Only a year before the painting on the left, Muhammad Zaman painted the one on the right of a single iris. It is extremely realistic and is probably the Kashmiri iris, a type that grows quite tall. Although Reza Abbasi's son, Shafi Abbasi, had painted numerous images of flowers, usually with birds perched in them, this type of flower painting relates more closely to botanical prints and paintings from Europe. Without a specific print model, one can only speculate that Muhammad Zaman was inspired not to copy a print, but to apply the same approach to depicting a flower with which he was familiar in Iran. So this is a flower that grows in Iran and Central Asia. Like so many non-Iranian works that are related to European or Indian prints or paintings, this iris may have been conceived as the result of exposure to a foreign image. But the result is an original and sensitive image of a familiar flower. Next slide, please. And finally, the subject of this last painting I will show is the distribution of Nowruz gifts by Shah Sultan Hussein, the last Safavid Shah, in 1721, a year before the fall of the Safavid dynasty. The king is seated in the middle of a very dreary group of courtiers who are dressed in robes of plain cloth, in contrast to his gold brocade coat and his tall gold turban and his fur collar. It is the work of Muhammad Zaman's son, Muhammad Ali. Here the faces are naturalistically painted, and so the figures could be identified by those who knew them. These portraits are achieved through modeling and close observation, producing an almost photographic tableau of this official occasion. Overall, as I said, the crowd looks miserable as they try to argue for their share before the fall of the dynasty. A light source coming from the right highlights their faces. Sorry. Excuse me. Now, the cloudy sky behind them reflects the dismal mood of the group. The painting is pivotal in many ways. It is the last dated painting of the Safavids. It reveals how thoroughly Safavid painting had absorbed European techniques, and it presages the expansion of oil painting in the Zand and Qajar periods, particularly scenes of Qajar kings and their families and retinues. Now, oil painting had already been introduced to Iran in the late 17th century, but it, as you know, grows much more in the 18th and 19th centuries. The painting also marks the complete departure from the idealized portraits of the 16th century and acceptance. It shows the acceptance of individualized depiction. While this artist need not have seen a foreign print or painting in order to produce this work, he had learned what his father had taught him. This painting, in a way, sums up all of the so-called shocks from encounters with unfamiliar art that gave energy and originality to the development of Safavid painting. Thank you. I'm so sorry again for all the delay. I'm happy to answer questions if you want to put them in the chat. And I have to admit that in 8 minutes, I must leave because I have to be on another Zoom call. So
yes, I think you are. Thank you, Professor. It was great. It was an absolute honor to have you. And I think you are tired, and I can, if there were any questions, I can email you, and if
fine.
If you agree. Yes,
yeah, that's
because
absolutely fine.
You're tired enough, and
I'm not tired, actually. I'm fine. I hope I didn't sound like I was tired. Compared to the last picture, I'm not tired at all, you know? All those sad people at the court of Shah Sultan Hussein.
Yes, but it was great. Thank you very much. And
could you see it on the full screen?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Yes.
It was reduced on my screen, but I hoped that you could see larger.
No, it was large enough. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, please feel free, anyone who has lasted through this, to ask questions, and I'll happily try to answer them. And I don't promise I can, but I think some of you are creative people. You may be architects in training or whatever, or artists, and you will understand the sensation of discovery and amazement when you do make a discovery and how you want to make that part of what you do. So I'm really interested in the creative process. And that is a constant, I think, across time and geography. So I hope that came out here.
Yes, thank you very much. It was great.
All right. Well, Khuda Hafez and Kheli Mamnoon. And I hope to meet you all one of these days.
Yes, I hope to see you in person in Iran.
I do too. Absolutely. I miss it.
Thank you very much.
Back. Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.